Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies. This is a YouTube video podcast where we explore storytelling on film, as well as interviews with industry professionals who work in film, as well as other areas within the arts. I want to welcome to the show Jason Bailey, who is the author of Pulp Fiction, the complete history of Quentin Tarantino's masterpiece, the ultimate Woody Allen film companion, Richard Pryor, American ID, and It's Okay With Me, Hollywood, the 1970s and the Return of the Private Eye. He is a graduate of the Cultural Reporting and Criticism program at New York University's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Vulture, The Playlist, The Village Voice, Vice, Slate, The Atlantic, The Dissolve, IndieWire, and Flavor Wire, where he was film editor from 2012 to 2019. And his latest book, which we're discussing today, Fun City Cinema. There it is. We both got one. New York City and the movies that made it. Jason, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Robert, thank you for the invite, man. I really appreciate it.
No, my pleasure. And I just wanted to say, right off the bat, this is an incredible book. I mean, I devoured it.
Thank you.
I absolutely loved it. I just had a funny story before we jump into it. Is when I was looking at your biography last night, and then I saw, why does the ultimate Woody Allen film companion ring a bell? And I also have it, and it's a funny story is that my wife's family live in here in Canada, in Nova Scotia, and we were visiting because my brother-in-law has a cabin like way out in the woods. I don't even know where it is. and my mother-in-law bought a bunch of books to so people had things to read. And I'm going through it and I'm like, oh, this looks really good. And I was really 4 years ago, I was really enjoying it. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to ask her if I could take it. So I went up to her and I said, Carla, do you mind? Is there any chance I can take this book? And she just looked at the cover and she goes, he's sick. Woody Allen is a sick man. And I said, and then I turned to her and I said, Carla, you bought the book. you bought it and brought the book. Yeah. I just thought, I tell that story, so often. But I just thought I'd share that because I was on a subway laughing hysterically when I connected that you're also, you're also the writer of this one. But I read it then. I wanted to read it again to thoroughly go through it. But on the subject of Fun City Cinema, I thought the best thing to discuss first, because I know that you knew that you wanted to write about New York City filmmaking after finding out about Executive Order number 10. So for people who don't know what that is, can you tell us a little bit about what that is all about?
Sure. I'll try to keep it brief because it is semi-complicated.
Yes.
The American film industry basically started in New York, but moved to the West Coast pretty early in its life for a variety of reasons, which I get into the book. And then for, about a half a century, almost every movie was made in Hollywood, even if it was set in New York. All of the studios had sort of a New York street set on their back lot. They would use sort of nondescript interiors. At most, they would maybe send a crew out to get a little second unit footage, or maybe they would just use stock footage. But, tons of movies still took place in New York, but very, very, very few of them ever shot there because it was logistically complicated and it was prohibitively expensive. And just there was a whole ecosystem that had been built out in California that was in place and that no one really saw much need to displace.
Right.
John Lindsey was mayor of New York for 2 terms starting in 1965. And, was a real sort of Kennedy-esque, Camelot figure, this sort of handsome, almost matinee idol, who actually was a bit of a frustrated actor. and who had kind of a celebrity air about him, and spent some time with actors and filmmakers when he was on the campaign trail, and found out about this, that that the reason that movies weren't being made in New York was that it was this really complicated logistical process that required all of these permits and costs, and you had to bribe the cops, and you had to and the crews were much more expensive. It was just this whole thing. And so he made that one of his campaign promises, that he would bring movie making back to New York City, which would be good for visibility and also good for the local economy. And in a rare move for a politician, he kept a campaign promise. Not long after he was elected, he put a couple of really smart people in charge of figuring out how to make this happen. And Executive Order number 10 basically established what we now know as the Mayor's Office of Film, TV Broadcasting, which streamlined the entire process, that basically made it to where you were working with the city instead of working against the city.
Right.
And it worked in a couple of different ways. It basically set up movie making as a one-stop shop, where you could just go and apply for one permit and get one signature and get one rubber stamp, and they would help you make your movie. They would supply police to help you with crowd control. They would get you, whatever sort of breaks they could with local crews. For a while, there were incentives, put in place. There were tax incentives involved. That all came back after 9/11, to bring movie making back to the city. But the point is, it was this example of government sort of taking a role in the arts in a positive way, which again is not a thing that we see very often. The ironic twist of Executive Order number 10, which John Lindsey could have never predicted when he put it into action, was that not long after movie making came back to New York, the city sort of started its descent into the toilet. And during the Lindsey administration, for a variety of reasons, some of which were his and some of which he had no control over, crime rose, poverty rose, city services decreased. The city became a much rougher place. That's the sort of, the urban hellhole of the 70s and 80s that you've seen in so many New York movies. Right. The ironic twist is, had John Lindsey not taken such pains to bring movie making back to New York, we would have never seen it so well documented in all of these great urban hellhole movies. So he sort of brought it on himself. That, the sort of the comic irony of that, I found really irresistible, and something that I wanted to look into and write about.
I had never heard of Executive Order number 10 until reading Glenn Frankel's Shooting Midnight Cowboy last year, because he talked about it. And, I just had never put it together that really there wasn't much filmmaking before the mid 60s in New York. I mean, we're looking at almost 40 years where, and of course you talk about in the book, which ones, the highlighting the great ones that were filmed there. But I had no idea. So were you, because for some reason I just associate New York so heavily with even Hollywood filmmaking. So to think that for that long there was hardly any filmmaking, I mean, did that also come as a surprise to you?
When I first started looking into it, it was very shocking. And again, because there is no shortage of great movies that are set in New York. And if you don't know to look for those sort of telltale markers of the New York movie that's shot in Hollywood, a lot of them did it pretty well, and they would incorporate, second unit. Sometimes they would fly even, their actors out to do a couple of days of them like walking into buildings and stuff like that, so it was, and in general, that era was not, in American cinema, mainstream American cinema, verisimilitude was not sort of the aesthetic order of the day. Most movies just kind of looked kind of fake. So it didn't really make a huge difference if they were shooting them on location or not. But as a result, the ones that did, it really stuck out. And a lot of times they would make a big deal of it and make that part of the promotion or even of the movie itself. The film that we cover for the 40s chapter is The Naked City, which opens, with the producer, Mark Holender, doing this whole voiceover about how this is New York, and we shot this movie in New York, and this story took place in New York, and New York, I mean, like really sort of selling it.
Yes.
So it was,
Yes.
but so it happened. But when it happened, it really was more of a novelty. And then that started to change after World War II. You know, there were a couple of innovations then. You know, the sort of the Italian neorealism movement, and some of the other cinema that was happening in post-war Europe had put an emphasis on this sort of hybrid documentary narrative idea. Seeing that kind of stark realism in your dramas became something that some Hollywood filmmakers were like, hey, I'd kind of like to try that. And then also, you know, during the war, newsreels became part of the moviegoer's diet. That was how they got a lot of their news. There was no, you know, there was no CNN. And so again, the you know, the sort of the visual language of realism and nonfiction started to become more, you know, audiences became a little more open to it.
Right. And you know, I know that you initially were going you pitched the book by covering 25 years of New York cinema, and then
Correct.
Abrams said, "Hey, how about 100 years?"
Yes.
And so I, you know, I know I know you're a film critic. I know you know, we mentioned all the books you've written, so you're a writer. But you know, on the one hand, as I know you said, it was, you know, very exciting to get this opportunity, but that much research, I'm just curious, was that overwhelming?
Yeah.
Was that nerve wracking for you?
Very much so. It was, I mean, and the thing that I had to come to terms with right off the bat was that with a topic this huge and with so much possible material to take in, there was just no way I was going to see everything that would be relevant. There was no way I was going to read everything that would be relevant unless I had 10 years to write the book, which I didn't. When you're taking on a huge scope of information like that, a lot of it, frankly, is just planning, is just sitting down and saying, okay, well, these are the most important films. These are the films that most directly address these ideas, you know, doing enough sort of advanced reading to say, okay, well, this is because in every chapter I'm trying to tie, I guess I should mention that the format of the book is that, as you said, it covers 100 years.
Right.
Each of the 10 chapters covers a decade of New York history and focuses on one sort of key New York movie of that decade. But in an attempt to make that seem not sort of random and scattershot and to sort of synthesize it, you know, I tried to pick a movie that's not only sort of a definitive New York movie, but also that speaks fairly directly to what was happening in the city, in its history, politically, economically, socially. And so, you know, part of the selection process going in and figuring out what the research was going to be was saying, okay, well, what is each chapter historical focus going to be? And then what is the film that sort of correlates to that? And then what are the pieces of research that speak to that history? What are the other films that speak to that as well? So that it doesn't feel like it's just, you know, a list book. But
Right,
so everything is sort of folding into whatever the big idea of that chapter is.
right. And what was, you know, because I know that you, like, for example, the 2000 the 80s decade, you know, a friend of yours was arguing over whether you should do the right thing or Wall Street. Were certain decades just like hard to just boil it down to that one? I mean, I know you talk about a lot of movies, but I mean, the focus of each chapter is one movie. Was there just no doubt that the 60s is Midnight Cowboy, Taxi Driver is the 70s, or how did you just get it down to that one pick?
Every chapter was easy except the 70s and the 80s, because again, that was the primary interest. Those were the films I was most excited to dig into. Those were the films that had the most reflection of the city. And so just picking the one in those 2 decades was very hard.
Yeah, I bet.
But I don't think I ever, once I settled on Taxi Driver, I didn't really vary off of that like that. It's such a snapshot of the city in decay, and that I knew was what the 70s chapter would be about. And no film I captures that decay as vividly as Taxi Driver does.
Yeah,
and then when you add in some of the stuff about how it was literally shot during the summer when everything was falling apart and there were garbage strikes and a heat wave, and the police, handing out the Fear City pamphlets, and like that, all of that was happening concurrently, which is like, okay, well, this is kind of a no-brainer. The 80s was harder because in that initial pitch, the 80s chapter was going to focus on Do the Right Thing. And then when Abrams asked me to expand it, I knew that there was no other choice for the 2000s than 25th Hour. That's the definitive post 9/11 New York movie.
Absolutely.
And in the interest of variety, I didn't want any one director to be represented by more than one chapter. And like, to be fair, there are multiple directors who could have had multiple films in different chapters, but I was like, that's one ground rule I got to lay down, because in each chapter, the director is sort of a character that we're spending some time with. And so once it became clear that the Spike Lee movie was going to be 25th Hour, it's like, okay, well, what else are we going to talk about in the 80s? And then I realized pretty quickly that, the sort of the way that Wall Street and the financial industry and the sort of conspicuous consumption of that scene was a huge part of 80s New York. It became pretty easy to just sort of slide over to Wall Street. And honestly, like, I also want to say, especially, when you're an author, there are just certain logistics that you want to take into account. I knew I could get to Oliver Stone. My friend Matt Zoller Seitz wrote a wonderful Oliver Stone book with Mr. Stone's direct participation.
Oh, wow.
For Abrams, like not long before I was writing this book. I reached out to Matt. I said, can you put me in touch with Mr. Stone? He said, absolutely. He'll be happy to talk to you. And he was.
Yeah.
He was a terrific interview with, and a great subject. Like, he's getting up there in years, and it's been a long time since he made Wall Street, but like crystal clear memory of everything that happened on that set. So I think that all worked out for the best, honestly.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I thought the interview with him really enriched that whole decade, because as he had said, his father worked on Wall Street. And so he was seeing how the men working on Wall Street, how the behavior was changing. Like, there was a great line where it's like, you didn't talk about money, you whispered about money. And now, these there's no whispering.
They scream about money. Yes. Yeah.
And I was like, wow, so. That's really interesting. So the thing I love about the book so much is all the history. Because I mean, it's not, again, for audiences watching this, it's not just as Jason said, only talking about the movies. It's really talking about what's happening in the city and the politics, and how those are, of course, influencing the movies being made, and vice versa. But I always knew New York was a hard place to live, but after you read this book, it's like there are some chapters that are just hard to, like, I really felt like I can feel it on a visceral level, particularly once you get into the 80s and gentrification starting, the city just being the wealth gap just getting worse and worse. I mean, of course, like, again, I knew all these things, but the details are such that I feel like I'm one of these homeless people on the street, these poor people. I mean, I thought you really brought the reader right into the world. So it's
thank you. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Yeah, no problem. Absolutely fantastic. You said that you saw well over 300 films when you were researching the book. I'm sure a lot of these, of course, as a film, as a writer, as a critic, as a filmmaker, that you saw a lot of them already. But were there some really great discoveries that you hadn't seen before that you can think of off the top of your head?
Absolutely. Well, and honestly, a lot of ones in the sort of era that I had discounted. There were a fair number of sort of 50s and 60s things. A great Gregory Peck movie called Mirage.
Oh yeah, I've seen that too. That is quite good.
It is good, and really evocative. A couple of Delbert Mann pictures that I wasn't aware of, that actually I found out about when I talked to Martin Scorsese. The Bachelor Party is one of them. So there was, there was a small scene, which I had read about in the book, or when I was researching the book, of, some of the sort of TV filmmakers of the 50s who moved from film or from television to film, and had, were comfortable in New York and like shooting in New York and didn't want to relocate. And so sort of used their little bit of weight threw it around to get to keep working in New York. And then in the 80s, you know, honestly, a lot of the genre films were things that I had never seen. I'd never seen Maniac before I made the book.
I haven't seen
And
that either.
it's, I mean, especially it's a harrowing horror movie, but way more so if you know its proximity to the Son of Sam murders
Mm.
and to what the murder rate was in New York when it was made, and the way that that film is really working the vibe of urban terror. Like when we think about 80s slasher movies, so often they're sort of rural or suburban, you know, things like Halloween is, you know, out in the suburbs. Nightmare on Elm Street is in the suburbs. Friday the 13th is, you know, out on the lake. There were not as many horror movies that were really about living in the city and the fears therein. And Maniac is very much about that. It is very much
Yes, I'll have
about
to check that out.
like being a being a woman. You know, there's a really terrifying sequence where a woman is just trying to go home on the subway and this serial killer is stalking her in a subway station. And if you know how genuinely dangerous it was to ride the subway at night, then that makes that all of that stuff seem even sort of more terrifying.
Right.
But the main one that I always talk about when this question comes up, the sort of my personal biggest discovery of the process was there's a terrific movie from 1981 called Night of the Juggler, which is hard to see. It has never had an official Region 1 DVD or Blu-ray release.
Oh.
It came out on VHS. You can go watch it on YouTube where someone taped it off of like
Of
Action
course.
Max, you know, like it's got the little Cinemax bug in the corner through the whole thing. But it's this terrific,
Oh yeah, I'm just
breathless
looking it up. Yeah.
James Brolin plays this, you know, this former NYPD cop who was laid off as part of the big culling of city employees, the big layoff, which was real history, which is in the book. He also testified in front of what sounds very much like the Knapp Commission, which is who Serpico testified in front of as well. That was
Right.
a real part of New York City police corruption in the 70s. So it really expertly works all of this real history into this character's backstory. And it's about this, you know, this former cop who's now a trucker whose daughter is kidnapped by this crazy man who thinks she's like Ivanka Trump, basically, who thinks he's kidnapping the daughter of like a wealthy Bronx real estate magnate. And so there's also all this stuff about Bronx real estate and how buildings are being, you know, arsoned purposefully for insurance purposes. Again, real stuff in there. All at the surface of a very good sort of white
Hmm.
knuckle action thriller that makes excellent use of, you know, there's a great long car chase out of Central Park and into Midtown. There's a great scene where he's like on 42nd Street trying to follow up on a lead and is like punching people out in a peep show. It's just such a beautiful slab of the city, and with, again, this real history in it, but it's also like a really entertaining thriller. So that's the one that I try to send people to, again, because like you can see it on YouTube. It's not a great
Yeah.
transfer, but you can see it at least and sort of get an idea of what the city looked and felt and seems like, maybe even smelled like, in the early
Right.
1980s.
Well, yeah, that I'll have to check that one out. That might be because I know you work with Jonathan Hertzberg at Fun City Edition. So
Yep.
that may be one he can that they can
Oh,
restore.
trust me, if you think I haven't asked.
Yeah, well, hopefully down the road.
Yeah.
I just want to give a shout out to to your graphics team here
Oh,
because
yeah.
the photographs inside, I mean, everything just is so, you know, perfectly done with all the, you know, this incredibly dense
Yeah.
writing inside. And I don't think you know, when we think coffee table books, we
Right.
just think pictures, but this is not just pictures. This is a real
Yeah.
great story. Do you have say in photos, or do you just
Yeah.
give that to the team? Okay, so how did that collaboration work with
I
the
mean,
team?
it was fascinating. You know, like I say, I hadn't initially envisioned the book as a coffee table book. I had envisioned it as, you know, just sort of a book with like maybe a photo section in the middle. But I had been, you know, talking to my editor Eric over at Abrams just about working together on something, and we had a project we were in the early stages on that fell apart. And he was like, do you got any other ideas? And I said, well, I have this thing, but I don't know if it's an Abrams book. And he said, well, send me the proposal and we'll see, And then the more we talked about it, and the more I thought about it, Abrams, they enjoy blurring that line, they like making sort of beautifully presented books, but where the text is not just about serving that, but where the text is dense and rich and well researched and well written. And I had seen that in Matt's books, the books that he had written for them, about Wes Anderson and about Oliver Stone. And so we just kind of said, well, let's give it a shot, let's see if it works.
Mhm.
With the illustration of the book, there were a couple of tiers on it. There were a certain number of historical photos, just sort of general historical, that I had to find, mostly in the public domain through Library of Congress and New York Public Library, stuff like that. Some behind the scenes photos that I cleared from the photo services, and that was all its own fun little headache. But the actual fun part was that, yeah, a lot of the images that are from the movie are literal screen grabs.
Right.
I ripped the Blu-ray, for highest quality of image,
Yeah.
and took that, MKV file and opened that up. And I have a program where, you can screenshot things, and it became that was one of the most enjoyable parts of the process, was to just find recognizable things and to see the way the city had changed, and to get those little snapshots that are a lot of times just the background, but that you can sort of, when you're looking at it in an image, you can pay a little bit more attention to. And I should mention too that most of the still frames in the book, and many, many more, are on an Instagram that I set up for the book. The Fun City Cinema Instagram,
Yes.
is full of unused, just everything that I sort of screen grabbed and considered for that process. And then kind of the best stuff was what made it into the book.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. Well, I'll leave the link in the description box below for that
Thank you.
Instagram page. If anyone wants to check it out. Again, we've already touched on some of the people you interviewed, but yeah, you interviewed, some of the greatest filmmakers, writers, in the industry. So Scorsese, Jerry Schatzberg, Susan Siedelman, Oliver Stone, Greta Gerwig, Noah Baumbach, Larry Clark. What was it like to talk to all these various masters? was that overwhelming, or
It
how was
was.
that? Yeah.
It was. I'm not an, I have done interviews. I've done, I'm a film journalist. I've done them, but it's never been a specialty. It's never been the thing I'm best at.
Right.
But I did my best. And especially with it becomes almost a matter of sort of time management, because you only have so long with these people. And
Right. Right.
I could have spent a day
Of
talking to
course.
Martin Scorsese. I had 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So
Wow. Really?
So you
Wow.
make the most of that, and you hyper focus on the specific things that you want to make sure to get a good quote
Right.
that can drop right into the text. With
Mhm.
Scorsese in particular, I'll just tell this briefly. I was chasing that interview for 2.5 years.
Oh, wow.
It was the first interview that I confirmed and the last one that I conducted.
Wow.
It was conducted, I want to say, 5 days before the manuscript was due.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Just because that was how long it just kept getting delayed. Because this was when he was making The Irishman, which was a long process, and so they said, great, we'll do it. We'll have to find time when Marty gets done shooting. And so I waited until the shooting was done. I was like, hey, can we do that interview? Like, well, now we're in editing, so we gotta wait till he's done. Okay, great.
Yeah.
So now we're editing. Okay, hey, maybe we could do it now. Now we're in post-production, and the de-aging is very complicated, and Marty's very busy right now, and it was just, well, now we're in the Oscar campaign, but after the Oscars are over, and so obviously I just kind of wrote around that. But that was great, because then I knew also exactly where I needed his input. I could, again, make the best use of that 20 minutes to ask just about the sort of handful of things where I really wanted something from him on that particular point. So
Right.
in that way, it was just fine. I transcribed that interview. I dropped those quotes in where they needed to go, and then there we were.
Fantastic. No, there was something he said that was a great quote that I had, because I'm a big Scorsese fan, and I've read a lot of books on him. And something he said I'd never heard him say was when he was shooting in New York, his short films in the early days. And if people stopped him on the street to be like, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" He said, we're just with the Naked City, you know, because that was
Yes.
like one of the one
Yep.
of the few shows that was shot
Yep.
on location. I thought, wow, you
Yeah.
know, again, you just think of New York as this place that people were always pointing cameras, but
Yep.
that's it's quite something. There's something that I'm not quoting Paul Schrader directly, but he said something that was making me think about just storytelling in general, where he said, you know, like he likes the Times Square, the Disney Times Square now, because he doesn't have to worry about getting stopped by, you know, hookers and pimps and drug dealers
Yes.
and in the 70s. And you know, it's but which is, to me, I'm like, well, that, yeah, because on the one hand, I don't think I would want to either, but yet I don't want to see a movie now really about
Right.
that,
Right.
about people rich living in New York. I want to go back to
Right.
the 70s. So did you ever wonder what it is about these gritty stories that were, you know, what we're talking about, Panic in Needle Park in a bit, and Born to Win and Taxi Driver, Midnight Cowboy, that are really gritty and dark? Why are these still so appealing, or why were they so appealing then? I mean, what do you think?
I mean, I think the purpose has flipped as the city has flipped. I think at the time they were appealing because they really did seem to be capturing something that was sort of raw and vibrant and living. Like they
Right.
really seemed like a living snapshot of what that city was.
Mhm,
I
mhm.
think now and by we, I mean viewers, but I mean especially New Yorkers, we are drawn to these now because we're fascinated by how much the city has changed. And it's very easy to romanticize that from the sort of safe distance of the post Disney New York. This is something I've grappled with a lot, especially as I've talked to people who were here then and now.
Mhm,
That a
mhm.
lot of us who, I moved here in 2006. So
Right.
this is alien to me, the world that's in Taxi Driver, the world that's in Midnight Cowboy. So of course I find it fascinating, and and I wonder what it was like, and I want to be a part of that. And it's very easy to forget that was real danger.
Yeah,
That was not for tourists. That was not,
right.
I would have gone down there and gotten my pocket picked or
Yeah,
worse.
yeah.
Um, so it's very easy to sort of fall into that romanticization because we're viewing that from the safe distance of through the screen of through the television set.
Mhm, mhm.
But I don't think I'm unique in that. When I go, especially the most popular movies in here, these films screen in New York all the time. Like we did a series of them at the Alamo Drafthouse out here when the book came out, but beyond that, even like Film Forum frequently will do, New York series and so forth. Whenever I go see Taxi Driver, Taking a Pelham 123, Midnight Cowboy, Panic in Needle Park, it's always a sold out house full of New Yorkers who
Yeah,
are chuckling at some of the discrepancies, some of the juxtapositions, who enjoy that dichotomy
right.
of New York then versus New York now. So, I think our aims have changed, and that's just sort of how movies are, that they
Mhm.
can be one thing in one era and something completely different in another one.
Right, because I mean, even here, me being in Toronto, Canada, I mean, most people I know who are big film buffs, um, also love these films, and we're not looking at it from, oh, look at how New York has changed,
Right.
or from a historical perspective. We're just like, these are great stories
Yeah.
and films, and I can only kind of give my own answer, but I suppose it's the, you know, struggle is always what audiences can relate to, whether it's a
Absolutely.
drama or a comedy. And obviously these films are full of it. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's something I've been grappling with myself recently.
I think too, something that's important to mention as we're talking about the outsider perspective is that these were also really powerful and potent images, and portraiture of the city that have persevered even as the city has changed. That in certain pockets of America, especially those who that are sort of more fed into like a right wing media stratosphere, they still think it's like that here. Like they still think like
Hey.
when I moved here, I lived in Kansas the first 30 years of my life, and like relatives and even friends would be like, is it safe there? Are you going to get mugged there?
Right.
Because they know New York of Death Wish.
That's a good point.
They don't
Yeah.
know this version of the city, because that portraiture of those 70s and 80s films is so
Strong,
overwhelming and visceral and powerful, and it stays with you even as the city has sort of moved on.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point, because I can remember just in the last 10 years or so, if I had a friend who moved to New York or they had lived there, and I remember a director I worked with, he once said, "Oh yeah, no, I lived in Harlem there." And in my head, I'm like, "Harlem? Oh my God." But now I'm like, he's like, "No, it's not like
Bill
that anymore."
Clinton's office is in Harlem. Like,
oh God.
that's about as gentrified as it gets when the ex-president has an office there. Yeah.
Right. That's really fascinating to me. One thing you pointed out was the humor that you saw in the 70s filmmaking was usually darker humor. Like Born to Win, for example, has a lot of black humor. Once we get into the 80s, a lot of that, when those stories, and because New York is still really struggling in the 80s as well. This is when it begins to change. But it's still really struggling. And a lot of the humor, as you pointed out, it had a much lighter touch, more along the lines of a Woody Allen. Any idea why? I mean, I guess it's hard. Is it just the way the wind blows sometimes, right? But
It is.
I wonder why that happened that way.
I mean, the way the wind blows is a really good way to put it. It also has a lot to do with who was making those movies. And in the 70s, especially, the sort of the black comedies of life in New York, the things like, Little Murders or The Out of Towners or Where's Papa, these really pitch black New York comedies.
Yes.
These are all movies that are made by New Yorkers, that are written and directed by New York residents who are sort of making light as best they can of the horrors of living in the city. A lot of the 80s cinema in New York, there's still plenty, Lumet's still working here, Scorsese's still working here, et cetera, et cetera. But, you see you had a lot more outsiders coming in and exploitation filmmakers to some extent. So a lot of the, movies like, The Exterminator and stuff, these sort of urban hellhole movies were maybe not by New Yorkers who sort of got the vibe of the city. But I think a lot of times too, the comedies that were being made by outsiders were often informed from that outsider's perspective.
I see.
A lot of the comedies of the 80s are explicitly about the outsider coming into New York. The fish out of water comedy was just generally big in the 80s, but it was especially popular in New York.
Yeah. Coming to America and
the Coming to America, Crocodile Dundee, Moscow on the Hudson, Brother from Another Planet. Splash is like a literal fish out of water story. And to a one, almost all of those are California filmmakers.
That's a good point.
Who came and made a story about a New York, about an outsider who comes into New York and is initially, probably, terrified or put off or confused by all these eccentrics and weirdos and so forth, and then sort of slowly learns to adapt and to love the city and to love weirdos and all of their eccentricities. Crocodile Dundee, did I say that one? That was a huge one too.
Yeah.
So, they're all from that perspective. At the same time, the sort of general gist of what was happening from a PR perspective in New York was very much about tourism. That this was the era of the I Heart New York logo, and where that was seen as one of the ways for the city to dig itself out of this financial hole that it was in was by reintroducing it as a tourist destination, which it very much had not been in the 1970s. And so I think that's sort of all of a piece, and just in the way that movies sort of capture what's in the wind at the moment.
Right. Yeah, I never thought of it that way, but now that you mention it, you're right. A lot of those filmmakers were outsiders. Something I wanted to ask you about, something you pointed out here, which I thought was really interesting. You said here, once you got to the 2000s in the post 9/11 world, you said in the wake of 9/11, moviegoers weren't interested in morally complicated protagonists like a sympathetic drug dealer. They were looking for good guys beating bad guys, and the simpler each of those roles was played, the better. So I'm curious because I know you talked about this in the book. You saw after World War II, we had film noir, and people were interested in darker stories because of what they had went through. We have a similar situation after the Vietnam War. Of course, when we get into 70s filmmaking, people were interested in seeing on screen, think maybe not consciously, but what had just occurred, and the story sort of informing that, whether directly or indirectly. But why do you think in post 2001 everything just became good guys versus bad guys, Spider-Man? I mean, why do you think those kind of stories? I mean, the ones you mentioned, yes, there were some, but it wasn't. Why do you think that became less appealing for people?
That's a really interesting question. And the I think the contrast between this era and those that you mentioned is that those were eras where a huge chunk of Americans went off to fight, and that
That's true. Right. Right.
and comparatively the percentage of Americans who were directly involved in sort of post 9/11 military action was quite small. Um, so there wasn't that sort of collective PTSD that I think you're very correct is so directly tied to the noirs of the post-war era, to the new Hollywood of the post-Vietnam era.
Hmm.
I think here 9/11 felt like a thing that had happened to us, even though it had only directly happened to a small percentage of us.
Right.
And then the post 9/11 military responses only happened to a small percentage of us. But
Hmm.
moviegoers liked that conflict because it was so black and white, that it was
Oh, right.
Saddam's the bad guy,
Right. Right. Right.
Osama's the bad guy, wanted dead or alive, and that also tied, these things don't exist in a vacuum, and that tied very much to sort of a simplicity in storytelling that had happened from kind of the 80s on, that sort of post New Hollywood hangover that begat, the Simpson Bruckheimer era, where storytelling became much simpler. I think that's all sort of the culmination of that too, outside of any sort of, world political events. But I think that all kind of came together at that moment.
Right. Yeah, you know what, that's a really good, really interesting answer, and I hadn't thought of that. I thought perhaps, I mean, we can only perhaps speculate, but I thought perhaps because of the blockbusters coming in the late 70s, because people were just used to those kind of stories, the big action films,
Yep.
big blockbuster films. So, there's just people are just kind of used to that in the mainstream. I thought perhaps that's why, it's like, oh, well, yeah, Spider-Man is the big.
Yep.
I mean, I know that even in those stories, they incorporated. It's been a while since I've seen since I've seen it, but
Yeah.
yeah, I
No,
had it.
it had been a minute since I had watched it. I don't think I'd seen it since maybe it first came out, like on DVD.
Right,
And
right.
when I revisited it for the book, I was sort of taken aback by how
Yes, yes.
directly it was attempting to sort of take the national pulse of post 9/11 America, both in some of the things that were just there accidentally, and in some of the reshoots, some of the things that they added in before that movie came out in the summer of
Hmm.
2002.
Hmm. Once you get into the 2010s, again, we're seeing uh, gentrification getting worse and worse, thanks to the likes of Bloomberg and Giuliani and Koch and the
Mhm.
various mayors, who really pushed out any, like, middle to lower class people. And you pointed out something like, when you, just for example, the film Shame, which I love, and how when Fassbender is running, goes on that run, that long run, and how there's hardly anyone. I mean, I
Yeah.
know it's nighttime, but it does, as you said, it has a soulless
Yeah.
feel to it, which really worked for that story. Um,
Absolutely.
and yeah, when I think of the other New York films, yeah, it just, that life is, even if they're good movies like Shame, that same life is just not really quite there because the city's changed so much. So I was curious, as someone who's lived there for 16 years, and you have two daughters and a wife. Are do you get concerned about about staying in the city? Or I mean, I know myself, me and my wife, we have a son as well, and Toronto is a similar situation, and we get concerned, like, oh my God, are they
Yeah.
going to push us out of here eventually? So I was just curious. I was curious if you get worried about that, as I'm sure a lot of New Yorkers do.
I mean, the what's happening in New York right now in terms of the rent crisis and stuff, and this is all outside of the scope of the book. A lot of this even after the book's publication. But what's
Yeah,
happening right
yeah.
now in terms of the way that landlords are squeezing rent,
Mm,
the
mm,
extent to which Eric Adams, our new mayor, is enabling that, is not unconcerned with that. It's all part of an ongoing pattern where
right,
it's a city that is run by rich people, primarily for rich people,
right.
and is aided in that quite directly by several arms of of the city government, including the NYPD.
Mm,
De Blasio did his best to push back against that.
yeah,
I think he came in with good intentions, and they pretty quickly got smothered by just the machinery that was in place that
right.
you can't fight. He also, fumbled a few things pretty, pretty stupidly.
Mm,
Um, but I worry about the life of the city. I worry about the personality of the city. I worry about New York being New York and not just, this sort of generic vanilla urban landscape.
right, right.
Um, but that's also something, it, it's also very easy to get too personally concerned about that, and to keep in mind that this is a city that's been through it.
Yeah,
That
right.
people have had these concerns about New York as long as it's been a city.
Mm,
And I felt very self-righteous about these things until I did the book, honestly. And in the epilogue of the book, I lead off with this quote about how the city is losing its personality and it's falling apart, and it's not what it used to be, and it's from Harper's from like the 1880s or something. Like,
yeah, I saw
people,
that.
this has been,
Every-
every iteration of New York is convinced that that the current one is the end of it, and they felt that way in the 70s when it's an era that we're now
right,
romanticizing. So,
right.
ultimately, I think just New York is a living organism, and it changes, and it adjusts, and the best that we can do is just kind of try to hang on to it as best we can.
Jumping into, we're discussing the Panic in Needle Park. Do you remember the first time you saw this film?
I saw it on VHS in the 90s when I was working at a video store.
Ah,
And I was in my first flush of Al Pacino fandom. This is
yes,
like
me too.
this is the early 90s.
Right.
Like, I had seen the Godfather movies. I saw all of them before the third one came out in 1990, and then he kind of had a good run there in 91, 92. Glengarry, Son of a Woman. I was like, this is my guy now. So, when you work in a video store, you have access to that back catalog. And so
Right.
I took that one home, and initially, the first time I saw it, not really knowing about New York, I didn't quite know what to make of it, because he was so young and it's
Yes,
so raw,
it
and
really is so different
um
than, I mean, The Godfather is a great film, but this is
yeah,
people with a hard
yeah,
scrabble existence, right? Which is not Michael Corleone.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And then, I revisited it a few years later when it first came out on DVD, and was much more sort of enamored of it. And then I moved to New York not long after that, and so it has been one of my favorites of that era since then, just because it's so vivid and so close to the ground. And then also, like, I spent a fair amount of time on the Upper West Side and sort of saw the real locations. And I don't know,
Mm.
that always makes me feel a little more connected to some of these films.
Yeah, no, I've always really loved this movie. And you mentioned in the book, I didn't realize that the DOP on this was the same DOP on Midnight Cowboy.
Yes.
I must say, I am guilty, like a lot of us, to always only look at the directors and stars and sometimes the writers. And ever since doing this podcast, I'm like, I've been making more. I mean, of course, there are the Michael Ballhaus and people that everybody knows, but I'm like, we have to start talking more about the collaborators. I think that's
Yes.
film scholarship in general. People are making an effort that way. But I did not realize that Adam Holender, I believe, is how you pronounce his name?
Hollander, yeah, yeah.
Hollander was the same DOP, and him and Schatzberg are still with us. And you met both of them, right?
I did. I interviewed them both for the book, which was a real thrill because they worked together on this one, but they had each independently and had other collaborations as well on some really fine New York films.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I just
Hollander,
looked that up. I didn't
yeah,
realize that. Yeah.
Hollander is a fascinating figure because this was a guy. He's from Poland. He was part of the sort of the Polish New Wave of Roman Polanski, and was in the that country's film schools around the same time. Kind of followed him over on Polanski's encouragement. Midnight Cowboy was his first American film. Like that was his debut.
Yeah.
His debut as a cinematographer in American cinema is in Midnight Cowboy, one of the great movies of the era.
Oh, absolutely.
He's a warm and funny man. He is passionate about the work. It was a delight to talk to him. I actually I interviewed him for the book, and then we did a Q&A after a Midnight Cowboy screening after the book came out. So I got to
Oh,
talk
that's
to him
amazing.
again. Yeah,
Oh, wow.
he's terrific, and
Yeah.
what I love about him, he has all these great stories about making this movie and about making Midnight Cowboy, and about sort of learning his craft on these American sets as a young film person, when he was first coming up. But then when you look at the later pieces of his filmography, like some of the later films that he did in the 90s, he had become the sort of the mentor. Like he was making really vibrant independent movies of the sort of the 90s indie movement. He was director of photography on Smoke and Blue in the Face.
Yeah.
He did Fresh, like I love the idea that when he became sort of an elder statesman, he was giving all of this knowledge to young filmmakers and helping them make their scrappy New York movies, and stayed in New York the whole time. Jerry Schatzberg, director of Panic in Needle Park, is in the same apartment that he moved into when he was making the Panic in Needle Park.
It.
Like I went to interview him there, and I was like, "You've lived
great.
here how long?" And he said, "Thank God for rent control." And I was like, "Wow."
Oh, yeah. And he, I mean, God bless him. I mean, he's 95, but he's very youthful. Like when you watch him in interviews, like he, to me, I'm perhaps seeing him in person is a different story, but seeing him on film, I mean, he looks like he's in his early 70s, maybe.
Yeah. No, he's and again, like I said with Oliver Stone, terrific memory. Still tells these stories like they were yesterday, which is all you want when you're researching a book. And the thing about Schatzberg too that blows my, because like I said, I went to his home to talk to him. This was his second career. Like he had this whole other 60s career as a portrait photographer and a fashion photographer, and like photograph like iconic images of like the Rolling Stones, and he's doing album covers, like the Blonde on Blonde album cover that's him.
His photography is incredible.
A lot of those images of Dylan in the Goes Electric period, like that's all Schatzberg stuff. And when I went to visit him, we finished the interview and he was telling me about an art exhibition he had coming up in Paris the next year. And he said, "Come into my studio, I'll show you how it's going to lay out," which I was, oh, great, let's go look. But then like, as we're talking, I just sort of glance over and he's got like one of the most famous Dylan 65, 66 images, just like sitting on the floor, like a big poster board, just like leaned up against the wall, the way you would just throw like some casual shit you had around the house. And I'm like, right, this dude is a legend. Right.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow. That is really, really incredible. No, this is a terrific film. Obviously it's on really about what it is to be a drug addict. What do you think the film is also essentially about from your point of view?
I mean, it's very much just about being a hustler, and that's, I think, one of the things that makes it a sort of timeless New York story is it's just about like getting by in the city. It's about, scraping enough money together to get your next meal, finding, a couch that you can, cop a squat on for a while. You know, it's about sort of the grind of city life in a way that doesn't change, you know.
Right.
And I think that is why it doesn't feel so much like a period piece.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, I've seen this film so many times, and every time I see it, I always see something new. And I think that's because of the way it's edited is incredible to me, because it has this there are some scenes that are very, very short, and they end abruptly, and they begin sometimes in the middle of the scene
Yep.
that follows. So you got to really pay attention, or it has that energy of the hustler just going
Yeah.
and going and going.
And it immerses you in this scene. Like it doesn't pause for like proper introductions of characters. You have to
No,
kind of
no.
figure out who
Yeah,
everybody is by the way they relate to each other. And then you're sort of like, oh well, that's that guy. He's, you know, you have to kind
exactly.
of you have the Kitty Winn character as an entry point because you're coming into the story with her, but you kind of have to figure all this stuff out as she does, which I
Oh,
think
absolutely.
is always a compelling way to tell a story.
No, I agree, and I just want to mention the editor, because the editor on he did such a phenomenal job. Evan A. Lotman, just to illustrate, my point. For example, when he and his brother Bobby as Pacino, and his brother Hank, played by Jeremy Bright, are doing that robbery, and Bobby is saying Hank, calling out his name, and you see that officer just in shadow,
Mhm.
and he's getting closer, and then it cuts to suddenly Bobby just in jail in a
Yep.
shower.
Yep. We know. We know what happened in between, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
Yeah.
But for it made me think a movie like this makes me think about editing in general, and it was something I hadn't thought of perhaps consciously enough, was that often when a scene will end, a character will walk out, or it will hold on a person's face, or a music cue
Right.
will come in. And so it gives the audience that feel, okay, the scene is ending and we're moving on to the next scene. And this film, I mean, it's not that it's like it's not that it's so all over the place, but a scene like that, audiences, I think, often are not used to that. And I think
Yeah.
I remember when I saw this actually for the first time when I was 16, and my father was watching it with me, and I was feeling uncomfortable watching it with him
Sure.
naturally, because
Sure.
the drug addiction, the
Yeah.
drug scenes, and it's a difficult, it's a tough film. And I remember at a certain point he said to me, I don't think this film, there's something wrong. Like, I don't, because we were just watching it on TV. He thought that it was not put together correctly,
Right.
because he's used
Yeah.
to more
But those
conventional
but
film.
but the whole film has to have that sort of like off kilter
Absolutely, yeah.
sprung energy. And you're right, that's a really effective way to impart that to an audience, to not know what to expect, because you're
Exactly.
sort of
Yeah.
you're eliminating some of the visual language that
Yeah.
they've grown accustomed to.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I think is really, that always brings me back to it, in terms of the reality of it and the that sort of almost, documentary realism that we've discussed. This was Schatzberg's second movie.
Right.
He did an earlier one with Adam Hollander called Puzzle of a Downfall Child, which is a good film, which is worth seeing.
Yes,
It's
yes. I like that quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's very much the first film of a fashion photographer, because they tell you, write what you know, do what you know, tell a story that you're comfortable with. So it is about a fashion model. It's
Right.
very much in that milieu that he was familiar with. And the look and feel and style of that film reflects that world. It's very slick,
Absolutely.
it's very
Yeah.
sleek, it's very professional. And one of the things I like about Schatzberg as a filmmaker was he said, okay, well, for the next one, I want to do something that's 180 degrees from that. I want to make something that's not staged, that's not slick, that's grubby and captured and handheld. But one of the things that we talked about that he specifically said after that first movie was, he said, I don't want to shoot on sets anymore. I don't like, it's too false to
Mhm.
shoot a movie on a constructed set on a soundstage. I don't like that. And so he made a point of that every single scene in Panic in Needle Park is shot on a real location.
Yes. Yeah.
I think with these characters that matters. I think with
Oh
this
yeah.
story, you can tell that there's a way that poverty is constructed in Hollywood filmmaking, or even in New York filmmaking. There is an artifice to the way a set builder, a set dresser, an art designer creates the apartment of a drug addict that just is different than the way a real apartment feels.
Right,
And
right.
the specific detail that I mentioned to him, and that I really, it's weird how you seize on particular, just tiniest things in a movie that you always think of when you think of that movie. But I have lived in a fair number of shitty New York rental apartments.
Right, right.
The way the walls look in
The
this movie,
walls,
in
yes.
those apartments, because they've been painted over with just like a coat of the cheapest white paint every time a
Yeah,
tenant moves out. And
right.
these places have such a high turnover that, you know, by the
Yeah.
70s, these are pre-war buildings. There's 30 coats of white, of shitty, not built to last white paint on
Right.
all of
And
those
all the
walls.
cracks in the walls.
All the
Yeah.
cracks in that paint, all
Yeah.
the peeling, all
Oh
just
my God.
the wear and the weather, the things that apartment has seen. That's not a thing that you can construct on a set.
Right.
That's a thing you
Exactly.
have to go find. And then
Yeah.
an actor in that environment responds accordingly. And an
Yeah.
actor
Yeah.
acts differently when they're in a real place, as opposed to when they can look 3 inches to the left and see, you know, the soundstage.
Right.
I think that's a huge part of why this movie feels the way that it feels, is
Yeah.
because of that sort of that commitment to authenticity and location. And then
Mm,
also, and Hollander and I talked about this at length. One of the things that they were really striving for in Midnight Cowboy, and that he, you know, returned to in this, was how they were going to capture street scenes, even with dialogue, without locking down a street and putting extras in place and so forth, to try to insert their characters into everyday life in the city, and not have anyone know that they're making a movie. Um, and this is something, this is a recurring thread through the book. Like, everybody was always, clear back to the jazz singer, to the crowd in the
yeah.
1920s,
Hiding the camera.
hiding the camera in laundry carts, in
Yeah.
bread trucks, you know, using long lenses, you know, all this sort of thing. It was harder to do in those days because of the limitations of the technology. But by the late 60s and early 70s, when Hollander was lensing Midnight Cowboy in this, film stocks had become fast enough, and cameras had become lightweight enough that they could do handheld stuff on the street the way that the French New Wave auteurs were, that they could hide a camera 2 blocks away, and lenses were good enough that they could put a long lens in it and just get characters walking down the street having a dialogue scene using
Right.
radio mics, that kind of thing. You know, anytime again that they could take advantage of the real location that they had, of the real world that they had access to, and the real world that these characters were based in, you know, that this was a film that was based on a photo essay that was about the real junkies of Needle Park. Anything that they could do to put them into that environment was going to be beneficial to the actors and was going to be beneficial to the film. And they were constantly looking for ways to do that, to bring that reality into this fictional narrative.
Well, I like this quote from Schatzberg in the book, was that he said to Hollander, I want it to feel as though we just placed the camera here, hit record, and walked away.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously it doesn't feel like they just did that, but
Sure.
sorry, I mean, obviously they didn't just do that, but it's certainly, it does feel like it's these are just happy accidents, one
Yeah.
after another. I mean, for example, as soon as you see Pacino as Bobby when Helen gets out of the hospital, he's talking to this guy on the street corner. I'm like, there's no way that guy was like a background. You know, and you
Yeah.
actually hear the dialogue. He just,
Yeah.
oh, you know, I'll see you later, or whatever he says. And I was really, after reading the book, I mean, this is the beauty of your book. And again, people watching Fun City Cinema, it will really enrich your New York, your New York film watching, because I was looking at all those things too. The walls, you know, the fact that there's no music at all, there's no
Yeah.
score. The colors, everything, it's very, you know, it's dark brown, it's dark green, it's dark blue. There's hardly, it could have, you know, literally have been a black and white film. What I find what I was really interested more so when I first saw the film, as a young when I was younger, of course, I was you know, just I'm sure like yourself, just loving and wanting to see everything with Pacino and really
Yep.
interested in those roles. But Kitty Winn here is Helen.
Holy
What a
shit.
performance! I
It's an
mean,
incredible performance. I mean,
yeah, it really is.
it was the performance that people were originally talking about. Like
Yeah,
it,
yeah,
she won Best Actress. The
a
film played at
ton.
Cannes that year, and she
Yeah,
won the Best Actress award. Like she was a huge deal.
yeah,
Um,
she's
and
fantastic.
everybody thought he was very good too. It wasn't like everybody was like, who the fuck is this guy? But it is interesting how their paths sort of diverged after that. That she didn't
Yes.
work much more, which is I think a loss. I think there's
Yeah.
a
No, I
real
agree. I
there's a
agree.
real skill there. The other sort of thing that I do love though about Pacino in this that Schatzberg confirmed for me, this was a story I had heard, but always sort of secondhand, was that when Coppola was working so hard to cast Pacino, famously,
Yeah.
bucking the odds and and the wishes of studio executives to have him play Michael, you know, this film hadn't come out yet. Coppola was working purely on gut and on seeing him on stage and on his screen tests. So he did ask Schatzberg if he could come into the editing room and just see some finished sequences just to make sure that his feeling was right about this guy's ability to hold the
Right.
camera and sustain a scene. And so he
Right.
did. He came in and he showed him some scenes, and Coppola
Yeah.
said, "Yep, that's what I needed to see. Thank you," and headed out.
Right. And I know that also convinced Paramount. There was like 8 minutes or so
Yep.
in it that they thought, okay,
Yeah.
we'll cast him. And yeah, no,
Yeah.
he has an anger about him, which is I don't know if I should necessarily say it's a rare quality, but let's just say I don't see it often. So perhaps it is a rare quality. But when he gets mad, he doesn't just get mad. His anger is very violent. I mean, when he gets mad in these
Yeah.
scenes, you can really feel it. When he finds out that she's been working as a prostitute and she, in the apartment is just screaming at her and she hides in the bathroom. And even towards the end of the film, when she is in a position where she has to rat on him or else go to prison, and she's just lying in bed and he doesn't even know why she's kinatonic all of a sudden. And just the way he takes the covers off of her and says, smarten up and get some clothes on, there's just a rage there. That is a rare quality, and I imagine just his talent, as well as he had a hard upbringing himself, right? So I'm sure that
Right.
is part of it, you
No, I
know.
mean, I think this was that quality was a big part, I think, of both what made this performance so electrifying, and you see some of that 2 years later in De Niro, or the next year, sorry, in De Niro's performance in Mean Streets.
Yes,
That the
yes.
moments where suddenly these guys are like, it's like a live wire, you're actually worried they're gonna hurt somebody,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah.
The degree to which they're able to put across that electric kind of dangerous anger, I think first of all, it's something that they don't, that you're right, that kind of softened in their own acting, much as to something closer to kind of what Brando is doing. There's certainly no shortage of Pacino shouting and being angry in later movies, but it
Right.
never feels as dangerous
No,
as
it
it does.
doesn't. Yeah. Yeah, no, it really was from these roles that started with this, and you saw in Serpico and in Godfather
Yeah.
too. I mean, and Dog Day
Yes.
Afternoon, and no, it's stunning. But the character of Helen, again, as you said, I mean, the audience, it's an ambiguous film in a lot of ways, and you have to put things together on your own. You have to really kind of go to it. And Helen, for example, Bobby's a little easier to figure out why he is the way he is, but Helen, for
Right.
example, we don't know much about her other when they're having lunch on the grass early in the film after they meet. She just says she's from Indiana, she went to art school, and it was fine. So you don't.
Yeah.
She's very vague and distant about her past. And when you see her getting to know Bobby and very quickly falling in love with him, and at first, I was laughing this time. Does have a black humor about it when he's introducing her to all of his friends and Hank, his brother. he's so casual about it as if she's already part of that world. He's like, oh, this is Hank, he's a robber,
Right.
no big deal. Yeah.
Right.
You see
Yes.
at first she is uncomfortable at first, and then gradually she becomes very much a part of that world, and she becomes a
Yeah.
prostitute, she becomes an addict. So you don't really know why she loves this guy so much. And again, it's the way the wind blows, right? You can never pin down why someone
Right.
loves anyone. You can speculate, well, they
Right.
have this in common or this or whatever. But it's a feeling, it's a connection, and we don't know. We just accept it. And I don't know if you felt that there was something you saw in it that was appealing about him for her. I mean, I was curious if you had any thoughts on that.
I mean, I think honestly, first of all, I buy the romance mostly because their chemistry as actors is
Really
so
good.
good
Yeah.
and so convincing. Like I feel like they like each other and care for each other. And then also honestly, he also finds her at a moment of great vulnerability
That's true. Because of
and
the
is kind to
abortion
her.
off the
Yeah,
top.
and
Yeah.
is kind to her in a way that her old man at the moment, very young Raul Julia, is
Oh,
not.
right. That's
You
true.
know
Yeah.
that, and that honestly, a lot of times is what manipulative partners will do, and he is. Obviously this was not a good relationship for her to get into. Is they see vulnerability, they see weakness, they see a way that they can convey care, um and exploit that. And I
Mhm.
think there's a little bit of that too. Also, you know what, he's also young Al Pacino. He was extremely hot.
He's a
He's
handsome guy,
very,
man.
very charismatic.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
real. He's and with the sort of proper background that she mentions, like it's probably fun initially the danger of a guy who'll just like lift a TV out of a truck,
Yeah. Yeah.
and sell it so he can buy you a picnic lunch. Like I'm sure that all is, that can seem like fun until it isn't.
Right.
Which is
Right.
kind of the subtext of most drug movies. Like it's a lot of fun
Yeah.
until it isn't.
Until it isn't. Yeah. No, that's a good point. And she, what I found also, another discovery for me in this one was the fact that, again, because as we said, the way it's cut, um scenes end abruptly and they go into the middle of the next scene, and that there's a part of the story. What I like about the film is like this endless cycle of, they're in a good mood because they've got some money and because they can get drugs, and then they get high
Yep.
and then they're out of money and now they're pissed off because they can't get drugs, and it's just this
Yep.
endless cycle. But there's a point in the film where he can
Yep.
suddenly become what he calls a supplier, which I suppose is like a drug dealer. And you
Yeah.
see him go in and he gets all
Yep.
these drugs, and it's like, he's wearing a mask like we're all wearing now with COVID. And, he takes all these
Yes.
piles of cocaine. And then right after that, he's outside, he's joking around with his friends. Everybody is having a good time. And what I noticed this time is that Helen is the only one not having a good time. And right after that, he's down again sitting with Hank. Now Hank is addicted. As he said earlier, he was just chipping.
Right.
And she's like, hey, where's the drugs? Why is there no more drugs? And he says, well, I gotta save some in case I get busted, because then I need to sell the drugs to raise money to hire a lawyer. And then immediately after that, he goes to his stash and it's gone. And then he gets mad at her, blames her. And I always believed her. I don't know how you felt when she said, I didn't know where it was. It must have been Chico or one of the other guys. And then he goes, I
Right.
told
Right. Right.
you. And I realized, oh, she probably took it. I don't know. I mean, the story, they don't tell you, right? And then
Yeah.
he can't get any more. How is the supplier going to give him more? As he says, I can't get any more. And then boom. I don't know. I don't know if you gave much thought to that sequence, because that is something I really never really thought about.
Right. No, I mean, I think that is one of the great things about about a movie like this. And honestly, I mean, I don't mean to get too global with it, but about a lot of the great movies of the 70s is that because they were working out of this sort of more abstracted morality, that they didn't feel like they had to tell you everything. They didn't feel like they had to tell you everything story-wise. They didn't feel like they had to tell you everything morally. You know, and like Helen is a much more sympathetic character than Bobby, but she also kind of does some fucked up stuff too, you know,
Yeah, yeah, that really popped out to me too this time. I mean,
and
she rats on him, she steals
yeah,
the drug.
yeah. And that I think is a big difference between when you think about a movie like that then and now, is that, you know, when you have when you tell a story like this now, you have to give the audience, you know, a likable protagonist. You have to give you would have to make Helen more of a clear victim than she is here.
Right, right.
And what I think is sort of interesting, and I don't think, I don't, to be clear, I'm not accusing them of this. I do think it's very instructive to compare the film to the movie that it most clearly directly inspired, which is the Safdie brothers Heaven Knows What.
I still have to see that.
Which
Yeah, I've been meaning to see it because I love
it's
them. I
worth
just haven't
it's
seen it.
worth seeing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's worth seeing, but it's a very direct. I mean, they've acknowledged it. They're not, you know, fucking around about it. It is about, you know, heroin addicts, street kids, gutter punks in New York, but in, you know, 2010s New York,
Right,
as
right.
opposed to 1970s New York. And so in many ways it's sort of a continuation, or sort of a revisitation, or how does that story work in that version of New York? And in those ways it's really fascinating to watch them together. The 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 balance of storytelling in that one is much more geared towards her. It's much more her story. She is much more of the victim in it. She, again, is not, you know, doesn't come out clean, like does, you know, some bad things herself. But the sort of Bobby-ish character, who's played by Caleb Landry Jones, is much less sympathetic than she
I
is.
see. I see.
Is a much harder and
Right.
more exploitative, abusive character than even Bobby is in this. So I,
Okay.
you know,
Okay.
it's kind of instructive to look at those two films, you know, in comparison with each other.
Yeah, I'll have to see that because this is the beauty of particularly this decade is that characters, these people are, you know, morally complicated and they're not necessarily
Yeah,
bad, but they have to do bad things. And in this story, as the police say, you know, a junkie will always rat in order to
yeah,
get out of jail or get out of jail early. And
yeah,
so on and so forth. I just want to mention some of the supporting cast because the supporting cast in this is incredible. Richard Bright, of course, is Hank, and we later saw him in The Godfather. Alan Vint as Hotch, the cop. Keel Martin, who's, you know, when that scene when they're all doing heroin and they really focus on him. I mean, it's so realistic. Jesus, I mean, it looks like they're
yeah,
actually doing it. And they
yeah.
focus on him, and his eyes just, you know, are so glazed over as he just falls over after getting that hit. And it's really, really stunning. Of course, Raul Julia, who we mentioned, Marcia Jean Kurtz, who you'd see in, you know, a number of New York films. And of course, you recently passed away recently, Paul Sorvino's in one scene.
Yep.
Arnold Williams, you saw him in a lot of 70s films. It's so good. And as Pacino
No,
said, it's
this
Romeo
is
and Juliet on dope or on heroin, you
no,
know.
that cast. A thing that had never really occurred to me before I talked to Jerry Schatzberg about this movie was, you know, part of the reason that you see such rich supporting cast so often in these great New York movies is that he said, you know, we had our pick of the best actors on Broadway. Like, you know, these were people who at night were headlining
Yeah.
major Broadway plays and off Broadway plays, who were the stars, but who had no problem at all coming and spending a couple of afternoons making a little extra money shooting a part in a film. And then everybody wins. We get a terrific actor in a small role. They get a nice piece of change. They're still, you know, a stage actor at heart. And there's a whole sort of other story to be told about that system and the way that, you know, the great New York casting agents, you know, like Marion Doherty
Yeah,
and
Marion Doherty, yeah.
Juliet Taylor and all of them, were plugged into that stage scene and how they took advantage of
Oh,
that
yeah. Yeah.
pipeline when they were casting these great New York movies. There's a wonderful documentary called Casting By.
Oh, it's so
Um,
good. I love
yeah,
it.
that gets into some of that stuff. But yeah, he said that specifically about this movie, that he, like, he loved that he was able to fill out his cast with stage actors, with just great stage actors.
Yeah, no, everyone is perfectly casted. And one thing about the film is that, even though Bobby finds out that Helen, became a prostitute and slept with his brother, and I mean, just God, these things that are, so twisted. And he's very angry at first, but even at the end when he gets ratted on and then he gets out of jail and Helen's there and he just says, well, and it's just they just walk away together. And I think that he just kind of came to be like, I don't like it, but this is the way it is, So it's just this, I remember in Pickup on South Street, the noir, the film noir, there was that element of just of an street level understanding that we're gonna have to sometimes do bad things to each other in order to get out of jail or to get drugs, and we'll all be together through it.
Yes,
Exactly. I don't know if it's necessarily as optimistic as I'm putting it, but it's so good. Was there anything else you wanted to mention about this film?
No, I mean we pretty much covered it. It was a lot of fun to talk to both of them about putting it together, and one of my favorite stories from the whole book was Adam Hollander told me that, when they were sending in the dailies to 20th Century Fox, after the first few days, the studio executives were sending back angry memos like,
oh my God,
where's the Empire State Building? Where's the New York skyline? Why are we paying to shoot this movie in New York if you can't tell that it's in New York? And it's like, we can tell it's in New York. It's just not the New York you're used to, which, right. I love that. I love anytime we're seeing a part of the city that, that maybe we're not seeing in 53 other films.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And now there's you have the podcast as well. And I know that you started the Fun City podcast because there's just so much to talk about and you wanted to talk about more. And I listened to the episode on Joe, which is a film I really like. And I thought that was an excellent excellent episode. Was really, really interesting about all the hard hat riots. I didn't know anything about that. So where's the best place for people to follow you on social media and to check out the podcast?
Like I said, the Instagram for Fun City Cinema is that. It's all one word, Fun City Cinema. Lots of great images from the New York movies that I reviewed for the book. I'm on Twitter at Jason-Bailey with the dash spelled out, and you link to all my work there. And then the podcast is also called Fun City Cinema. It's available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, whatever your podcatcher of choice is. There's a total of 10 episodes of that. And like you mentioned, we wanted to sort of fill in some of the stuff that we couldn't get into in depth in covering 100 years. It is a nonfiction narrative storytelling podcast. It's like listening to a little audio documentary of about an hour and change, where we play clips, we do historical background, archival footage, we talk to actors, filmmakers, historians, critics, people who sort of fill us in on various aspects of the films there, and we're really proud of how that came out. It kind of became its own thing that sort of stands on its own.
Great, fantastic. And I'll leave the links in the description box below where you can follow Jason online. And again, check out the podcast as well as get the book, Fun City Cinema, New York City and the Movies That Made It. It's wonderful. Really, really, really great book. And
available wherever fine hardbacks and ebooks are sold.
Yes. I loved I do so much reading on the subway, so it's it doesn't matter. You got to bring it on the train, even though it's a big book. I love some of the looks you get sometimes, like there's like this big book, but I didn't care. And just lastly, I wanted to thank your publicist Andrew Gabelli for putting us in touch at Abrams Book. Thanks so much. And Jason, thanks so much. I really appreciate that you took the time to come out today and have this lengthy discussion about the book and Panic in Needle Park. So thank you
so much for having me and for supporting the book. I really appreciate it.
Anytime. And I hope you can come again sometime. Talk another one.
All right, man.
If you are currently listening to my YouTube video podcast on the audio version and you've run out of episodes to listen to, head over to the YouTube channel where every single episode that I have ever recorded can be found, youtube.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies. I also want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the Patreon link, patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies. Patreon is bonus content that I create month in and month out, and it is based on polls that I put out at the beginning of every single month, which as a member, you will have access to vote on. So if you like my work and you're interested in supporting me over on Patreon, head over to the link for full details. And lastly, if this is your first time here on my YouTube channel, please consider subscribing by pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the movies logo. It is absolutely free to do so. The logo is floating above my head in the top left corner to your top left in just a second. Just click on that and then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new episodes or when I go live. Thank you so much, everyone. I will see you in the next episode.